I've decided that I moved down here from Cincinnati, and I've decided that we're like at least 3 weeks ahead of the northern latitudes.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to get started today. Hello and welcome to the last event of the semester for the Federalist Society on featuring race and firearms. Joining us today are two very notable scholars of the Second Amendment. Clayton Cramer is an American historian, author, software engineer, and astrophotographer. His research also informed Supreme Court decisions in the District of Columbia versus Heller, as well as McDonald versus Chicago. His scholarly writings in particular focused on the racist origins of American gun control laws, as well as the original meaning of the Second Amendment. Accompanying him is Professor Darrell Miller, who is also a scholar of constitutional law and the Second Amendment. His article, Guns as Smut, Defending the Homebound Second Amendment, was also cited in the MacDonald case by Justice Stevens in his dissent, which argued that guns essentially should be treated similar to obscene material, a freedom which is exercised primarily within the home and subject to more restrictions in the public sphere. Please join me in welcoming our two speakers today.
Okay. Thank you for having me here today. This is something of a challenge for me. I had a stroke last August, and when I get tired, I start to slur my words. If I start to become at all unclear, wave your arms and I will slow down and force myself to carefully articulate every word. My presentation today is about the racist roots of gun control, but that isn't the only motivation for such laws. Arms control laws have a variety of roots in many cultures, and even before the development of guns. These laws often existed to protect the political status quo by disarming the peasants. As an example, in 1598, Japanese warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi ordered all swords, short swords, bows, spears, firearms, or other types of weapons, unquote, to be seized from farmers to discourage rebellion against the samurai. The claim was that the goal was to protect the farmers from being encouraged to rise in useless and bloody rebellion. Within 2 centuries, the taxes that the samurai were collecting were 60 to 70% of the annual rice crop, and entire Japanese villages starved to death, and started the practice of farmers selling their daughters into prostitution to be able to feed the other kids. Only World War II brought an end in part to this medieval system of power. Europe was no different in trying to control the lower classes. Henry VIII passed a ban in 1514 on crossbows and handguns, which meant all guns less than 3 feet long, unless you met a property qualification. Theoretically, the goal was to encourage longbow practice because this was the common weapon of the English army. The net effect was to limit the new arms technology to the rich, and in subsequent centuries, hunting restrictions were often used to justify disarming the peasants in England. France also limited bow possession by peasants because of their fear of the lower classes after the Jacquerie Rebellion of 1358. Those who wrote for the upper classes argued that the peasants should go on all fours like cattle and eat grass and not be arrogant and wish for meat. Gun control in America has several roots, but race is the dominant one. America presented an interesting situation for a traditional English institution, the militia. The militia had always consisted of the freemen of the society obligated to defend the realm from external attack and internal rebellion. By the time the American colonies formed, the militia had been replaced by professional soldiers in England. Whoops. Boy, how many did I manage to hit there? The American colonies revived the militia because professional full-time armies were expensive. The colonies faced 3 threats: Indian attack, invasion and attack by foreign navies and armies, and as slavery became institutionalized in the latter half of the 17th century, fear of slave rebellion. By the start of the Revolution, every colony except Pennsylvania had a militia law that required every able-bodied free man, usually those aged 16 to 50, to be armed for militia duty, be armed by at their own expense and under their own obligation, and to turn out for militia musters or for combat. Most colonies experimented with laws banning sales of guns to Indians. Virginia actually made it a capital crime to travel more than a few miles from a settlement with more than 3 guns on the presumption that you were going to sell them to the Indians. These laws were generally unenforceable. What's interesting is watching how Connecticut continually complains about New York making it too easy for the Indians to get hold of guns, and pass stricter and stricter laws trying to stop this, and it never works. They finally give up on it. So these laws were generally unenforceable, and they largely disappeared by the time of the Revolution. Slaves were another matter. Many, but not all, of the colonies prohibited slaves from possessing arms, including guns, clubs, swords, and dogs, which were considered to be weapons. Often slaves were allowed possession of weapons with the master's permission. This is the beginning of the very first licensing laws, licensing possession of firearms in America are the ones that applied to the slaves. Some colonies prohibited even the relatively rare free blacks from being armed. Often these disarmament laws are passed the same year that free blacks are prohibited from voting, such as happened in Virginia in 1723. Most people don't realize that there were actually free blacks voting in America in the colonial period. There's actually a free black man elected in the Maryland legislature in the 1640s. The courts have sometimes explicitly recognized that there was a connection between citizenship and both the right and the duty to bear arms. The Georgia Supreme Court, in upholding a special tax on free blacks in the city of Savannah, drew all these rights of citizenship together. Quote, "Free persons of color have never been recognized as citizens. They are not entitled to bear arms, vote for members of the legislature, or to hold any civil office," end quote. Cooper and Worsham v. City of Savannah, Georgia, 1848. As the Dred Scott decision of 1857 also explained, if free blacks were citizens, quote, "the Constitution would give them the full liberty of speech in public and in private upon all subjects upon which its own citizens might speak, to hold public meetings upon public political affairs, and to keep and carry arms wherever they went," end quote. After the Civil War, the struggle over black civil rights revolved, even before the issue of voting came up, around the right to self-defense against the Klan and other less organized forms of intimidation. Those silly robes and hoods were not so scary once they had bullet holes in them. My paper, "This Right is Not Allowed by Governments That Are Afraid of the People," was published in George Mason Law Review and cited in the McDonald v. Chicago decision of 2010 as evidence that Southern gun control laws were one of the reasons why the 14th Amendment used the phrase privileges or immunities to include the right to keep and bear arms. This thing is a little twitchy. In the 1920s, many southern states found that mail-order sales of handguns were a problem for them because their own very restrictive gun control laws could be so easily evaded by purchasing a handgun through the mail. This leads eventually to the Mailing of Firearms Act of 1927, a federal law that prohibited shipping handguns through the U.S. Post Office. That law is still in effect. In 1924, Senator Shields, Democrat of Tennessee, was arguing for this mailing of firearms ban and explained that these sales made it hard to disarm black people. Quote, "Here we have laid bare the principal cause for the high murder rate in Memphis, the carrying by colored people of a concealed deadly weapon, most often a pistol," end quote. Last year, Charles Cobb's memoir of the Civil Rights Movement, "This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed," explained how guns made the Civil Rights Movement possible. The highly armed state of at least some civil rights activists kept the movement alive despite widespread domestic terrorism. He describes having trouble opening a door in Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s house because there were so many guns stacked up on the other side of the door. As part of this strategy, throughout most of its history, concealed weapon licensing was arbitrarily decided, usually based on race, and more recently in some states, campaign contributions. And the reasons sometimes appear in the decisions of the courts. We have an astonishing statement from Justice Buford's concurring opinion in a 1941 Florida Supreme Court decision, Watson v. Stone. Quote, "I know something of the history of this legislation. The original act of 1893 was passed when there was a great influx of Negro laborers in the state drawn here for the purpose of working in turpentine and lumber camps. The same condition existed when the act was amended in 1901, and the act was passed for the purpose of disarming the Negro laborers and to thereby reduce the unlawful homicides that were prevalent in turpentine and sawmill camps, and to give the white citizens in sparsely settled areas a better feeling of security. The statute was never intended to be applied to the white population, and in practice has never been so applied." Gun control based on race was not only aimed at blacks. California's current concealed weapon license law, which is in trouble before the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, was passed in 1923 as part of a bill that, among other things, prohibited non-citizens, at that time largely Chinese and Mexicans in California, from possessing handguns and required background checks for handgun purchases. The KKK-endorsed governor of the state signed the bill after a primary supporter of it explained in the San Francisco Chronicle that it would have a, quote, "salutary effect in checking tongue wars among the Chinese and vendettas among our people who are of Latin descent, end quote. At the time, Chinese immigrants were prohibited from becoming U.S. citizens, and millions of Mexican citizens had fled the Mexican Revolution into California. The replacement of the old-style discretionary permit laws in the 1980s and 1990s in most states has ended enormous amounts of discrimination and corruption in permit issuance. In some states like California, it's quite common to find a very strong overlap between the big contributors to the last sheriff's campaign and the people who have concealed weapon permits. Racism and gun control are not ancient history. 2 months ago, the guy who was the primary funder of gun control in the U.S., Michael Bloomberg, told the progressive Aspen Institute that the focus of gun control should be minority men. Quote, they just don't have any long-term focus or anything. It's a joke to have a gun. It's a joke to pull a trigger, end quote. Until 1967, California, like nearly all Western states, allowed open carry of loaded firearms in cities. Oakland Police Department had a series of confrontations with the Black Panthers and asked for a ban on open carry. The Panthers showed their usual political intelligence by showing up in the legislative chambers while the bill was being debated, heavily armed, rifles, handguns, and shotguns. This guaranteed fast approval on Governor Reagan's signature. The Gun Control Act of 1968 was passed by Congress after 2 summers of race riots across America. As even pro-gun control author Robert Sherrill admitted in his very entertaining book, The Saturday Night Special, quote, the Gun Control Act of 1968 was passed not to control guns, but to control blacks, end quote. Even the term Saturday Night Special, to refer to a cheap handgun preferred by criminals, appears to be derived from a term that was used until the 1960s to refer to a drunken brawl in black sections, N-Town Saturday Night. When California passed the nation's first assault weapons ban, the Roberti Roos Assault Weapons Control Act of 1990, it was passed on the emotional reaction to a mass murder by a mentally ill drifter in Stockton, but it was originally aimed at disarming inner-city drug gangs. I think it is no coincidence that this law, like many of its counterparts across the nation, was overwhelmingly focused on black guns like the AR-15, often exempting similarly functioning guns that were not black, such as the Ruger Mini-14. I don't think that's a coincidence. All this history has effects. Several generations of black men have grown up in societies where there was no lawful tradition of responsible gun ownership, either because it was essentially illegal like D.C. and Chicago, or the dominant media elite has influenced the population to see gun ownership as suspects, such as New York City, California, or New Jersey. This has an effect on how guns are perceived, and not in a good way. It means that lawful self-defense is questionable and creates a culture where the forbidden fruit of guns are attractive to the worst elements of a society. If gun control has this history of association with what could best be considered reactionary and racist thinkers, how did gun control become associated with liberal and progressive thought? Partly this was a response to the gun deaths of 3 icons of liberal politics, John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Most of you are way too young to remember how profoundly traumatic all those events were. Gun control has become the default response of progressives because the alternative is to ask what has gone wrong in black urban culture. About half of all murders in the U.S. are black on black. Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown are actually very atypical black deaths in that they were killed by white men. This is a distraction from a culture of violence, which is the real problem. At the core of this black violence problem is an absence of fathers and a subculture that idolizes violence, misogyny, and drug use. Partly the liberal and progressive enthusiasm for gun control is that these are urban elites. By the 1960s, violent crime rates in cities with black populations had risen to intolerable levels. Rather than ask why this problem was concentrated in a group that the war on poverty was supposed to have helped, or confront their fears of young black men, it was easier to demonize guns. What started out as racist hostility has morphed into a real and very serious problem in black communities, and really almost nowhere else. The northern tier of American states in the Midwest and Rocky Mountains have very relaxed gun control laws, and yet lower murder rates in every case than their Canadian Prairie Province neighbors who have very strict gun control laws. As an example, Manitoba is right across the border from Minnesota, and it has more than 3 times the murder rate of Minnesota. The white non-Hispanic U.S. murder rate compares favorably to nearly every European country. The point often lost is that blacks are not only disproportionately murderers, but also disproportionately the victims. The population primarily targeted for disarmament is also the major victim group. Andrew Papachristos and Christopher Wildeman of Yale have recently published a study that shows that, quote, 6% of the population was involved in 70% of the murders, and then all of those in the 6% already had some contact with the criminal justice or public health systems. Study after study find that not only murderers but their victims are overwhelmingly people with long criminal histories. Who your friends are is a bigger risk factor than race or poverty. Many people in ghettos arm themselves because the criminal justice system does not protect them, and gun control laws utterly fail to disarm their neighbors who are prepared to commit murder, rape, and robbery. NPR recently ran a piece about how blacks are starting to take advantage of shelters to conceal weapon permit laws in hellholes like Detroit to defend themselves. There is a very destructive subculture in which violence, misogyny, and drug abuse are a big problem. Solve this and guns aren't an issue. If you don't solve that problem, other weapons get used instead. It is always tempting to think that severe and often deeply embedded social problems can be solved by just passing some laws. The experience of gun control shows otherwise. Correcting serious cultural problems is slow and requires widespread support. Cesar Beccario was one of the major founders of the science of criminology in the 18th century. In his book On Crimes and Punishments, 1764, he observed that many laws are passed based on false notions of utility, that they will work regardless of reason. He observed that gun control laws were in that category. People prepared to violate the most serious laws generally ignore gun control laws. Quote, it certainly makes the situation of the assaulted worse and of the assailants better, and rather encourages and prevents murder, as it requires less courage to attack unarmed rather than armed persons. Thank you.
So I don't want to talk in the dark. Can we hit the lights? Maybe.
I'm not sure where the light switch is.
Well, I do want to thank Chase for inviting me to this panel, and for Clayton for coming out to join us at Duke today. And so I do not have a PowerPoint, and anybody who's had me in class knows I wouldn't know how to work it anyway. So, you know, I'll preface my remarks by saying I can't sort of imagine a more explosive set of issues to discuss in one panel than guns and race, unless we want to throw in abortion, and then, you know, we can just make it a hat trick. But, you know, it's a fertile area for writing. I write in the area, as does Clayton. But I think more, you know, less flip, but more importantly, it's a essential and very pressing social issue. The intersection of race and guns and gun policy and constitutional rights is one that I think is well worth really taking some time, and it tends to generate a lot more heat than light, and I'm hoping that this conversation that we have today will generate some light. So I think I would agree, right, with Clayton's basic premise, which is, as he wrote, that, you know, gun control has a racist past. He cited several regulations. I could cite some more. You know, here in North Carolina, it was illegal for free blacks to have guns or to sell guns to slaves without permission from their master. Even if we went back to the colonial era, as Clayton knows, there were regulations on selling guns to Indians or even repairing their guns. Arkansas had the same type of regulation, and as Clayton has identified, Ronald Reagan signed the Mulford Act after the Black Panthers staged an armed rally in the Capitol, or at the Capitol steps, and it was aimed at prohibiting the public carrying of weapons. In fact, Ronald Reagan was quoted apparently of saying, "No reason why on the street today a citizen should be carrying loaded weapons." That's what Ronald Reagan said. So, you know, one other regulation I'll mention. So Kentucky had a regulation that said, quote, "No person shall retain gunpowder, retail gunpowder to minors under 15 years of age or free colored persons without authority from his parent or guardian, or to slaves without authority from his master." All right, so without a doubt, the history of gun control in America is besmirched by racism and by white supremacy. And then, of course, we get to what Hume is sometimes referred to as Hume's guillotine, right? So what? All right, so that's the facts. So what? Gun control is enlisted to support racism and white supremacy. So is every other law, right? Property law, tort law, the entire 1787 Constitution, it's all racist. So so what? You know, I'm still pretty comfortable, if you think about that Kentucky statute that I just quoted, that it's probably a bad idea to sell gunpowder to minors under 15 years of age. I kind of like that, right? Even though, you know, the rest of that particular regulation is racially discriminatory. So it's a question about, all right, so the history of gun regulation in America is racist, but so is most every other type of law. And it's not like gun regulation is just something that happened in America, is new. As Clayton identified, it's got gun regulation has a fairly long pedigree. So the one that keeps cropping up, if you take my class or you sort of read about this stuff, is the Statute of Northampton. So the Statute of Northampton is from the 14th century, and that said, "No man, great nor small, of what condition soever he be, except the king's servants in his presence, and his ministers executing the king's precepts, could go armed upon penalty of prison." And this statute was affirmed in the 15th century. In the 17th century, it was actually part of the statutes that were encoded in North Carolina in 1792. Now, there's some debate, right, active debate as to whether the Statute of Northampton should be read as it was written, or does it have some kind of requirement that the regulation on public arms bearing be to the terror of the people. That is the sort of axis. But no one denies that this was an actual statute that was existed way before America was even founded. And as the Heller opinion says, right, all the Second Amendment does is simply encode a set of understandings that predate the founding of the nation. The one question then is, right, all right, so if gun control is been used for racist or racially discriminatory purposes, what do we make of that? What do we make of the fact that there were plenty of kind of regulations that existed that had no racial component to it because it was not part of the environment in 14th century England? The other thing I think that we have to be aware of is that the absence of gun regulation has also been besmirched by racism and white supremacy. So the NRA was founded in 1871 in New York, and there was another organization that was founded in the 19th century, and let me read you the first principle of its founding. Quote, "To protect the weak, the innocent, and the defenseless from the indignities, wrongs, and outrages of the lawless, the violent, and the brutal." Sounds pretty good. The 10th interrogatory of this organization was, "Do you believe in the inalienable right of self-preservation of the people against the exercise of arbitrary and unlicensed power?" That organization was the Klan. Now, the fact that the Klan assumes a certain amount of high rhetoric on self-defense, what are we to make of it? Well, I'm not here to say that it's the same, right? But I'm here to say that the fact that you have an organization, right, who also claims the banner of self-defense and claims historical privileges of going and riding armed and policing the neighborhood has to also work into the calculus as much as the regulation itself. So I think that the suggestion is, at least the is ought that we're talking about here, the suggestion is that, well, because gun control has a racist past, then well, there could be two things we could say. We could say, therefore, it's illegitimate, or we could say, therefore, it's subject to some kind of heightened scrutiny. And maybe that's true. Maybe that is right. Certainly, I think if we were to say, look, there's a regulation that forbids African Americans from possessing a firearm in their homes, that would clearly be a violation of the equal protection. If it was routinely found that African Americans could not get a permit for a handgun to have in their home, the doctrine of Yitgo versus Hopkins would say that that was a violation of equal protection. But I think that there's a danger, which Clayton has identified in his writings, of sort of transposing stuff that happened in the 19th century and saying, well, the political economy is exactly the same today, which it isn't. I mean, in the 19th century, blacks could not vote. Now they can. And in fact, if you look at some of the stats in terms of support for gun control, they tend to support gun regulation over firearm, less regulation or firearm rights by something like a 30% margin. As Clayton has shown, the incredible disproportionate impact of firearm violence in the multiples, 10 to 15 times the rate of hospital use for firearm assault injuries among young black males than white males, is a real problem. And I think that one that we should take seriously, and may very well drive why the solution that many in the black community in particular seem to support is not more guns, but fewer. And then I have to sort of ask the question, because Clayton quite rightly raised it, which is, yeah, it's one thing to say that's New York or Los Angeles elites, but I can sort of flip that around and say, well, why is the particular gun culture or the culture of elk hunters in Montana the one that is driving gun policy for major metropolitan centers like New York, Chicago, and LA? Elk hunters in Montana are not representative. They have an outsized representation in the U.S. Senate because of the requirement that there be 2 senators from every state, no matter what the population is. But I think we have to ask ourselves, as a matter, why would it be that would be the kernel for what gun control or gun freedom policy should be by elk hunters in Montana, and not by what the democratically accountable branches in the cities of Chicago, LA, and New York want. So I think I'll stop with that. It's just to sort of summarize, I totally agree. Gun control has a history of being racist. I will stipulate to that. I think the real question is, what do we make of it? The history of not having gun control is racist. And when the Klan was running around in South Carolina disarming freedmen, they said, the reason why we're doing this is because we've always done it, we have a right to do it, and you can't stop us. I mean, I encourage you to imagine this scenario. What does the law say about this scenario? You've got a local sheriff. The sheriff supports the U.S. government policy with respect to the freedmen, and the sheriff stops a armed man on horseback riding around at night. Hey, what you doing, Bob? Just out. What are you doing with those guns? Just out. We have a right to have them. All right, don't get in any trouble now. Right? Is that what we mean by the sort of liberty that we're talking about? And I want to focus, I'm talking about the public bearing of arms. I don't have any truck with the problem of having a gun in your home. I think it's good that Martin Luther King had guns in his home. I think it's good, that people have a right to have guns in their home. What I'm talking about is the extension of that to public spaces in which we get a far more and more difficult contested set of considerations, especially with regard to the intersection of policing, private policing, and racial suspicion.
First of all, I should mention that this question of what the statute of Northampton prohibited came up in a case before the North Carolina Supreme Court in 1843, State v. Huntley, and they made the point that it was the carrying of arms to the terror of the public that was prohibited by the statute of Northampton, and so they did recognize that the right to keep and bear arms included the right to carry weapons, as long as you weren't doing it for the purpose of scaring anyone. Would seem to be an argument for a right to carry concealed so that no one can tell that you're armed. And as to this question of illegitimacy, we have an awful lot of cases where, because of racial history, statutes have been, in fact, state constitutional provisions have been struck down. In Hunter v. Underwood, 1985, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down a provision of the Alabama state constitution that prohibited voting by people who had been convicted of crimes of moral turpitude, because the statute was racially disproportionate in who was disfranchised, and because the convention that which that Constitution was drafted was brought together for the purpose of figuring out a way to disfranchise blacks. So we have a long history of striking things down that we don't like because they're racially motivated, and we should either do that consistently or not do it at all. I think I'd rather go for doing it consistently. And as for this question about why do the concerns of elk hunters in Montana drive gun control policy in the United States, rather than allowing the individual governments to make these decisions, we could ask the same question: why is marriage policy being driven by the needs of the people of the Northeast and California, for overturning what the state legislatures and, in many cases, the populations of those states have chosen to decide is the correct definition of marriage? I should mention also that the Klan was often a major supporter of gun control. South Carolina is being an especially good example. South Carolina is one of the most remarkable places in that it actually, in 1908, I think it was, passed a ban on sale of handguns to anyone except law enforcement officers. And of course, the reason for that is that South Carolina was, at the time, very close to a majority black state. And of course, it was fairly easy for a white person to get deputized as a sheriff so he could buy a handgun. I don't think there were too many black deputy sheriffs in South Carolina at the beginning of the 20th century. I should also mention that on the question of whether the population supports a particular gun control regulation or not, this is often based on sometimes fairly substantial ignorance in the public about what the current laws are. I remember many years ago when I was living in California, they polled Californians and asked them, should there be a ban on mail-order sales of guns? And there was a strong majority in support of such a ban. The problem is we were only 25 years too late. That was prohibited in 1968. An awful lot of people support things that they have not actually looked at carefully enough to know whether this works or not. For example, a year or two ago, I looked through there are 8 states that have a requirement for either a background check on all handguns or all firearms transfers, a universal background check, which a lot of people think is a really good idea. Of those 8 states, only in 5 of them was there a statistically significant change in murder rates after the passage of their universal background check requirement. 3 of the states' murder rates went up, 2 of them it went down. So the fact is a lot of people just know this is a great idea, but there's just no evidence that it actually works. There's just an assumption. A lot of gun control is really built around making people feel safe, whether they really are any safer or not. Much the same way, California has a waiting period on handgun purchases. They've had it since 1923, and I can find no statistical evidence that it has ever made any difference on their murder rates. Their murder rates continue to rise every time they increase the waiting period from 7 days to 15 days. It continues to go up with a correlation of 0.84 between the waiting period in days and the murder rate in the state. So I think it's important for people to realize that because these laws do have a racist history, they deserve fairly careful scrutiny. And as I said, in many cases, even today, they remain fairly racist in their results. California, for example, in the mid-1990s, I did an analysis of how readily different counties issued concealed weapon permits there and what the racial makeup of the county was. And I found, not surprisingly, there was a very, very strong negative correlation between black percentage of population and permit issuance. Counties that were almost entirely white issued permits pretty readily. Counties like Los Angeles and Alameda and San Francisco with large black populations and where there was also a very high violent crime rate, permits were generally only available to people with strong political connections.
So I guess I got 5 minutes to respond. The Huntley case he's absolutely correct on the Huntley case. And there's many other cases that said, the statute of Northampton, that's a creaky old statute. And what's it really about is making people afraid. Although there are cases that say as long as one person is afraid, then the statute's been violated. And even in the Huntley case, if I recall correctly, the justices of the court say, yeah, I know you can carry your gun, but we kind of hope that we never live in a society in which this is just part of manly equipment that you carry around all the time. So on the one hand, there's an expression of, yeah, you can do it. On the other hand, there's an expression that it's kind of distasteful to do so. Let me talk about a little bit about the current laws, about do they work, and what does that mean for enforcement. So this is an important question about the empirics and what do we do with empirical data. And is empirical data that applies to one municipality the same that for empirical data that applies to another? And in the same way that I don't think that New York City, Manhattan policy should be run by should be sort of beholden to the policies of hunters in Montana. I wouldn't want the reverse to be true either, right? I mean, if I've got a long gun and I'm walking on a track, somewhere in Big Sky country, it means something different than if I'm walking down the street, in Greenwich Village. People understand that something different is happening. And what I'm suggesting is that at least with regard to public carry, I think that there's something to be said for those types of distinctions being respected. If not because we just live in a heterogeneous society with different people and concentrated in different areas, but in some sense because of the self-determination of many of these cities, right? Where is the concentration of minority power? Typically in big cities. And if the concentration of minority power in big cities, if they have a preference for more gun control than less, as it at least as it deals with public carry, then there's something to be said that is the fruits of all the hard-won civil rights advances where black people got the vote. Does it work? Well, I'll tie that back in with my former comment, which is one of the questions about does it work is, well, where is the judiciary supposed to be with respect to these types of questions? If it is, as Clayton has suggested, some kind of fig leaf for trying to effectuate a disarmament of minorities, yeah, I think that's a problem. But I suspect that a lot of these regulations are not enacted because of some kind of disparate treatment, right? It's not a stalking horse for some overt 14th Amendment violation. The suggestion that Clayton has offered is that there's some sort of problem with disparate impacts. But as you know from your first year con law course, disparate impacts are not 14th Amendment violation. The fact that you have the bus lines run one way as opposed to the other way, the fact that things close on Tuesday rather than Friday, right, might have a disproportionate impact on some people, but that doesn't make it a constitutional violation. It can be, It can be in the sense of the Congress can get involved and protect civil rights. And this goes to the third point, which is, look, if you wanted to have nationwide public carry of various kinds, the kind of disparate impacts that I would be most concerned about would probably be the disparate impacts that are represented by things like the shooter scenario. For those of you that don't know about the shooter scenario, this is a set of documented psychological experiments in which individuals are told to identify, right, whether somebody is holding a weapon and is a threat or is holding something that is innocuous, like a wallet or a set of car keys. And again, it has been shown that people tend to react more quickly and with a higher error rate when the person is black than not. So if we are going to have a society in which every single individual is essentially deputized to enforce the law as against every other individual, well, then I think we should at least be somewhat cognizant of the disparate impact problem. And if Congress wants to get involved in saying, yeah, we'll have reciprocity for concealed carry, but everybody has to take a souped-up training on implicit bias so that your training is at least, if not better, than what the police's training is, then I think that would make sense. And there's nothing that the Constitution says that couldn't be so.
Understanding that a lot of gun laws in the South were enacted after the Civil War with the purposes of disarming Black Civil War veterans. There's a new study, or a relatively old study, called the New Jim Crow that associates political and economic and educational disenfranchisement with overcriminalization of relatively minor crimes. One of the outgrowths of this is lack of minority populations, particularly young minority men, denied not only the right to vote, but the right to own firearms. I was wondering if y'all could make some comments in light of both the new Jim Crow regarding contemporary gun control and the way it's actually still applied to the same populations, even though with different reasons.
Well, as I mentioned, the Alabama Constitution of 1901 had a provision which defined crimes of moral turpitude as a voting disqualifier, and at least partly because it was expected it would be primarily used, as it was eventually used, to cause blacks to not be able to vote. And to some extent, if you can't trust people to carry a gun, I'm not sure why you would be able to trust them to vote, and vice versa. And there is, I think, a good argument that if there's a reason to take away a person's right to vote, that probably is indicative that they're not a very trustworthy person in general, and it probably ought to go the same way for both voting and for gun rights.
Any commentary on overcriminalization of relatively minor offenses as applied to minority males?
I think you're describing what is definitely a very real problem. I know that historically this has been a big problem in some parts of the country, and it's probably still a big problem even in some of the big cities. Idaho doesn't have, I don't know, I think I've met almost the entire black population of Boise. He pulled me over to give me a speeding ticket. So, but there's certainly the case that there's been a long tradition that police have tended to go after black young men and arrest them for fairly minor things. I remember some years ago I was testifying before a legislative committee in Ohio in support of a shell-issue concealed weapon permit law for that state. And one of the members of the legislature said to me, well, if we pass this law, the police will just arrest young black men who have permits and guns anyway. Her view was the police were simply beyond redemption, and that there was really no point in changing the law because the law wouldn't be, the police wouldn't follow the law anyway, which I thought was a very strange notion that you can't pass the law because you don't trust your police to enforce it.
So I think my last comment, thank you for the question, my last comment sort of feeds into that, right? So there's no doubt that high rates of incarceration and felon convictions for black males in particular disenfranchise them from voting, but also because of operation of the federal law makes them ineligible to have a firearm at all, right? No ammunition, no firearms. But that also applies, to Martha Stewart, who is a convicted felon as well. Now, it's Martha Stewart, and it's the mass of black males. So, in some sense, I suppose you could say, what this means is that if Congress wants to get in the business again of sort of enforcing constitutional rights under its Section 5 power, it can sort of create or suggest or, there's going to be a kind of commandeering problem, that states have to put in some kind of provision that allows people to get their rights back, especially if they're very old convictions, or convictions that are, not of a nonviolent nature, all that kind of stuff. And some states, including North Carolina, as a matter of its own gun constitutional provision, has said that superannuated convictions cannot debar somebody from being able to possess a firearm. So I think that's a live point, maybe for compromise between what we would otherwise think of as antagonistic groups. What I would say, though, is, and this goes back to my prior point, which is, look, if the question is, I want to reform the Ferguson Police Department, and I'm doing an investigation because of disparate impacts about the way that the Ferguson Police Department is actually enforcing the law, then at least I got an entity and a definite group of people that I know who to enforce it against. If the question is, I have to figure out, right, is there a disparate impact or is there racism in terms of the enforcement of law because everybody has basically been designated a police officer, which is exactly, by the way, what happened during Reconstruction. This is one of the major complaints of a person named Schurz, who did a study of the immediate aftermath of Reconstruction and said, essentially what's happened is all the whites have been deputized to police the law against all the blacks in the South. And the problem there is I've got no body of people. I've got no entity to police. Who do I do a DOJ investigation of if it's the entire municipality, right? Or if it's an army, right, of George Zimmermans rather than just George Zimmerman. And so, to me, the issue about overcriminalization and policing doesn't cut in just one direction, because if you don't have the police doing it, right, and you basically deputize everybody to enforce the law against everybody else, well, the same kind of disparate impacts occur there too, as we well know.
I would make the point that after the Virginia Tech massacre, Congress did pass a revision to federal gun control law that had the interesting effect that it encouraged states to make a provision for allowing people to get their firearms rights back again for cases where the conviction was either very old and the person demonstrated that they had, in fact, moved past that. And something similar is now happening with respect to very old mental disability disqualifications. There's been a recent case where the courts have ruled that a person who had been hospitalized for a month many, many years ago after a very messy divorce no longer was disabled from possessing a firearm. And it's certainly within Congress's authority to go ahead and reform the firearms disability law. And it probably it might even be within their authority to make that in some way tied to the question of voting rights as well.
I just want to make one other comment, which is I think that, like I said, I think there's some room for, compromise on this particular viewpoint, especially if we talk about disparate impacts. The problem is, of course, that not everybody, but there's an unusual sort of orthogonal relationship, right, between guns and other types of civil rights. So if you think about all the states for example, that have passed looser and looser gun control laws, or the allowed more concealed carry or whatever, those also tend to be states that make it harder to vote. So that black people can maybe get a gun easier, but they got to pass all these sort of checks before they are able to actually exercise the franchise. So this is not in any sense all people that advance these particular gun rights policies, but as a matter of sort of actual politics and party alignments, you don't see a whole lot of GOP-controlled legislatures, saying, "Oh, I'm really worried about disparate impacts about the voter ID law I've got, or these other things." It's just not, it's just not in the realm of the conversation, and perhaps it should be.
More questions?
Oh, come on, guns and race, and you can't rate. Lots of interesting questions. Yeah. Well, okay. So the idea is that the story about public bearing, right, of guns. The story about public bearing of guns is very complicated and very contested and very difficult to figure out. There's not one single irreducible narrative historical strand about that. It is one of those things which we have a lot of disagreement about. But we have no disagreement about the fact that people should have a right to keep and bear arms in their home for personal protection, right? That's what Heller and McDonald say. But even if we go to the very core of what the right is supposed to encode, which is the right of self-defense, you got the Castle Doctrine, right? You're not... there's every, in Anglo-American jurisprudence, the Castle Doctrine says you don't have to flee from your home. So if there's one place in which, right, the right is surely at its apogee, it is in the home. Everything else from that seems to be highly contested, right? Extremely contested. And in the absence of clear constitutional direction as to what that means, why isn't a solution to treat it just like we treat obscenity, right? You have a right to have obscenity in your home. Question about, obscenity. And I'm talking about adult obscenity. I'm not talking about, I'm not talking about child porn. I'm talking about adult obscenity, which isn't even a First Amendment protection outside the home, but it is protected inside the home. And if we treat the home as so singular for that type of right, then it seems like, to make the Second Amendment make sense with respect to all other rights, we can talk about it in a similar way. Now, I'd like to think that that was a really, novel and interesting insight, but I actually found out that Don Cates, right? Don Cates, who is a sort of maven of the gun rights movement back in the 80s, right, had suggested in a paper that he ended up repudiating later on, that, look, gun rights in the home, that's where it's at. Maybe some ancillary rights to take it to the shop and have it fixed and bring it home, or to buy it and bring it back, but that's it, And so that the constitutionality of gun regulations that would prohibit carrying, right, are as constitutional on that premise as the unconstitutionality of forbidding somebody to have a handgun in their home. Now, it didn't take long before he decided that that was not exactly the right point of view. And to his credit, he said, "I'm a scholar, I'm a student. I think I was wrong. I thought he was right."
I would mention Don is a friend of mine, and Don is a recovering liberal. But I would also make the point that we actually have quite a bit of data that does show that people did regularly carry firearms on their persons in the constitutional era. It was not a particularly startling thing. And what's interesting is every time someone comes up with an example to try to prove that this was not the case, we look at the evidence and find that no, it actually demonstrates even more strongly. There's one particular guy who was arrested and charged with manslaughter in Pennsylvania in the 1790s, and that was being used as an example for a while by some people on the other side to prove that had never been a right to carry arms outside the home. But in fact, what he was charged with was just with manslaughter. He was not charged with any violation of any law about carrying of firearms. I should point out that most states have now made it very easy for ordinary citizens to get concealed weapon permits, and yet the epidemic of racially disparate murders that everyone was expecting seem to be in fairly short supply. I've spent an awful lot of time looking through the examples that the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence puts out, and most of them turn out not to match very well when I go back and look at the actual news accounts.
And my response is, good. You know, that's the democratic process working, right? If you love guns and you want to vote for your legislator to say more guns everywhere, get rid of gun-free zones, let people carry guns in schools, stuff like that, well, who am I to say that that's the wrong policy? What my main beef is, why make it a constitutional matter and basically ice it into the Constitution when something might change, right? You got more lethal weapons, something might change down the road. Why make it a constitutional matter as a matter instead of a matter of ordinary politics and legislation?
We have time, I think, for one or maybe at the most two more questions, but anyone else?